You're listening to The Higher Ed Marketer, the podcast for marketing professionals in higher education. Join us every week as we talk to the industry's greatest minds in student recruitment, donor relations, marketing trends, new technologies, and much more. If you're looking for conversations centered around where marketing in higher ed is going, this podcast is for you. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. I am so grateful and honored to host this podcast with my good friend Bart Kaler of Kaler Solutions. And by the way, my name is Troy Singer with Ring Digital. Today's topic, niche higher ed, enrollment, change, and culture lessons from the front lines. Today's guest is Dr. John Chopka. He is the Vice President for Enrollment Management and Marketing at Ringling College of Art and Design.
Yeah, John and I go way back, and it's such an honor and fun for me personally to have John on the podcast. I think we met each other. I think we figured out about 15 years ago at he'll mention it in the conversation about the idea of a peer group that he was a part of that asked me to come and speak. I think at the time about this idea of Web 2.0, social media and stuff. So it's been a while. It's probably been longer than that. But I just remember meeting John and really, really enjoying his company. And he and I've stayed in touch. And we always hang out together when we're at conferences. And so it's fun for me personally to have him on here. And he's just recently moved down to Ringling College of Design and Art and Design in Florida. We had a chance to have breakfast a couple weeks ago when I was in the Sarasota area. So it's fun to kind of pick up some of the conversation that we talked about during that time, just about how change works and what it's like for him to come in as a new VP. And so I think he's got a lot of really good things to talk about as it relates to managing marketing and being able to see that change and the way that he kind of manages that change and just some really wise tips that he has. So I think you'll enjoy the conversation.
John, as you may know, we always begin our conversations with our guests by asking them something to share something that they have learned recently that may be fun, interesting, or something that some people just may not know. So it is your turn. The spotlight is on you. Is there anything that falls into that category that you would like to share to get our conversation started?
Well, love that question. Good to see you, Bart and Troy. Thank you for inviting me today. Mm-hmm. Now, I know this is something you all discuss frequently, so I was hesitant to point to AI as my something interested. But there's an elevated interest in that whole thing because I'm currently at an art and design school. And there's a whole debate about how far with AI. And as you all know, artists create, and competition with AI isn't necessarily an exciting proposition for many folks right now. And so I've been really excited to be at a dynamic institution like Ringling College of Art and Design, where they are building AI and an AI certificate into the undergraduate offerings for all students. Mm-hmm. And we just added a new major called Creative Technologies. And it's not necessarily just directed at helping students navigate AI, but it's the whole of technology and the impact it has on art and society. And I think the ongoing debates will continue about societal implications. I think every industry is having those debates with AI right now. But we are empowering the next generation of artists and designers and creatives, I would say, with the skills to really navigate an AI-driven creative landscape. So that's been this has been an exciting approach here. We wrestle with this at every institution, right? But there's something special, I'll say, about it at an art and design school.
Thank you. That is special and also a little surprising as I hear it coming from an art and design school. And that's a great reason for you to share it. Thank you. Now, before we get into the reason why we ask you to be on the show and to share your expertise regarding niche higher ed enrollment, change, and culture lessons, you and I ran into one another at the NACAC conference, and as we record this, it's a week after, and you shared a subject with me that we both agreed should be shared with our listeners on the podcast. So would like to know if you would do that. And I think that'll set a foundation of who you are.
Yeah, I really love telling part of my story related to my upbringing because it's so unique. Seldom do you meet somebody from my generation who lived in a home without indoor plumbing. But, my family and I, we bathed in a creek, we used an outhouse for a season. And I was born into a hippie family back in the late 60s. And we were into things like sustainability before that was even a word, right? We just lived off the land in the middle of West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go ahead and steal West Virginia's tagline. I had a wild, wonderful childhood growing up in Appalachia. And it was when I moved back to Northeast Ohio in the 70s that I would say it's the confluence of a pastor with educators at my high school that saw some promise in me and really fed my mind with this idea that I should consider going to college. And in many ways, I was the least likely to pursue higher education. But I feel so blessed to have had that experience. I met my wife and lifelong friends in college. My alma mater hired me for that first gig in admissions. That job you're just going to do for a couple of years until you get a real job. But fast forward 35 years, add a master's degree, add a doctorate. My whole career has become about higher education. And I often marvel at that. In many ways, I was supposed to work in coal mines and factories. And for whatever reason, God saw fit for me to serve in higher education. So my humble beginnings, I think overcoming imposter syndrome at various stages along the way, it created a resilience in me that sustained me for 35 years in enrollment management. And so when you see your role really directly having an impact on college access for the next generation, it gives you the oomph to get up and really go after it every day. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to share a little bit about it. People meet me and they're amazed I have spent 35 years in higher education and enrollment management. And I think my why sustains me.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I love hearing that background from you. And I would say to know you, I wouldn't have thought that you came into this world through a hippie family. So that is wonderful to share. And thank you. And I'm sure that others have the same feeling that I do. Like, I want to know more from this individual. Well, with that said, our first topic that we wanted to discuss with you is recruiting and marketing for niche institutions. So you have spent your career helping institutions that aren't trying to be all things to all people. How does recruiting for a niche school, whether it's an art and design college or maybe a smaller liberal arts institution, require a different mindset than recruiting for a large state university?
Oh, yeah, you're right. I mean, apart from a couple of years of work at a large public university, I've been at faith-based liberal arts institutions for most of my career, and then more recently at an art and design school. And I will say, before I jump into the niche schools that I've served, there is something about being at an open enrollment institution, a public institution. It's special because you realize as you're meeting with students, you have a pathway for almost everybody. I spent some time at a public university in Northeast Ohio in the mid-1990s, and it was known for some rigorous programs in, say, polymer science. And there were high admission standards for that program, but we also had a community and technical college. And so when you're meeting with a student in that setting, you can say, I have a pathway for you. And that was rewarding in and of its own, in its own sense. I could find a starting point for about any student, at that university. Now, the liberal arts colleges were a little more selective when I started. They've become less so. It's amazing how that's happened in recent years. I think as demographics and college attendance rates dwindled. But it's really come down to helping students find a fit. And that's a word I hear on this podcast a lot, fit, helping students find a good match. At an art and design school, there's an extra element that I'm really just learning about. and it's called the portfolio review process. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not qualified to review a portfolio, but my team needs to be ready to meet with the student and offer really constructive feedback on that portfolio. And I have to lean on them to do so. And I'm so impressed with the grace and honesty that they use to deliver that kind of feedback. You think about an artist who's showing you what he or she has created, and they're asking for feedback. And is this good enough to get me admitted into your institution? Some of our programs have limited spots. Ringling is known, for example, for computer animation. And we can take 120 students a year, and that's it. And they're competing for jobs with the likes of Disney and DreamWorks. So it's a delicate balance, I think, between dashing a student's hopes and offering helpful feedback in that process.
I like that, John. I think that so many times when you're talking about kind of those different types of schools, and especially when those schools are kind of similar. So I know Ringling has a lot of other art and design schools that they run up against, and the liberal arts schools that I know that you were a part of before have other ones that they run up against. But they always have to talk. We always have to talk about distinctiveness, and so owning your distinctiveness is one thing that I hear, enrollment leaders, marketing leaders talking about, helping their teams understand that. So what do you think that actually looks like, especially at a school like Ringling, when you're trying to figure out how do we really own that distinctiveness, even though we're already distinct? How do we even, add that so that when they look at us compared to another similar school, they still see that distinctiveness? Yeah,
boy, that's a timely question for us because, as you all know, being a niche school comes with maybe a better definition of what you're looking for in the market, but it also limits you on who's going to be attracted. For example, when I go to do name purchases that we do at colleges and universities across the country, I don't have as big a pool, to glean from. And so we're all about leaning into our distinctives. And for a place like Ringling, a lot of it has to do with niche programs. But they bear some explaining, like what is motion design? And how is that different from computer animation? Mm-hmm. What kind of job am I going to get with a major called entertainment design? So I have found myself really leaning into being able to describe the outcomes. And that really is where it lies for Ringling. We are all about shattering that myth of the starving artist. And in fact, our tagline is turning passion into profession. And especially dads, you're going to hear this.
Yeah.
They're going to ask, should I run away? Should I be scared that my son or daughter wants to go to an art college? I remember I had one dad tell me, hey, I really enjoyed your spiel on your college, but for us, it's going to come down to three things: jobs, jobs, jobs. And we lean into that here pretty heavily. We have solid outcomes. In many ways, they're coveted spots competing for jobs with the likes of theme parks. And I think I mentioned Disney and DreamWorks already.
Yeah.
But there's a whole list of organizations that come to Ringling year after year to get our creative graduates. And that's been a really exciting distinctive. Every institution is trying to prove outcomes. And I can take students to the building right next door. We can walk down a couple of hallways, and they're full of movie posters. And at the bottom of that poster is a list of our alumni who have contributed to those projects. Literally hundreds of posters.
That's cool.
So outcomes, man, that's our biggest distinctive right now.
Well, and I think even as you discussed that, just that last example you gave is the importance of this new thing. This next thing I wanted to kind of tease out a little bit is because a lot of us say, okay, we have the distinctives, we have the outcomes, but it's different of just putting a few logos on your website and some stats versus being able to tell the story like I think that poster does as you walk down the hallway. So tell me, how are other ways that you're kind of using storytelling to kind of, or even maybe other things that you see coming down the pike with trends or things that that Gen Z and maybe even their parents are kind of like, they turn and look when you start to tell that story, or their ears perk up when they hear it presented in a way beyond just the facts. Because I think there's something about emotions that may be what I want to get to.
Yeah, I was diving into Ringling's effectiveness in hospitality. And so for us, it's all about converting, visits into matriculants.
Right.
And out of my admitted pool of students who visit, we yield 55 to 56%. And that's really exciting. And I think it's because all across our campus are those stories that you referenced, Bart. It's faculty that we have hired from the industry who are teaching kind of where they excelled as they created in their professions. We're a place that believes in the best technology for our students. I got to see the guts of campus, if you will, right? I got to see our server room, and I know that's coveted secret space on most campuses, and it was amazing the power it takes to run the tools that our students learn from is really impressive. So we do things that demonstrate our commitment to excellence, our commitment to profession. It's our facilities, it's our faculty, and then it's the experiences along the way. We have a contest right now we're running with Universal, and students from all across the country can submit their ideas for kind of a cart at Universal, like a food cart, and why they design it the way they are, and the winner is going to get scholarships at Ringling.
Oh, wow.
And some visibility with Universal. A couple of weeks ago, I got to go on the Imagineering experience with our seniors in entertainment design. And we got to ride the Guardians of the Galaxy ride at Epcot. And then we met with Ringling alumni who designed that ride, and everything about that experience, from your time in line to what you experience after you get off the ride. And it really gave students a vision for the kind of work they can do with their creative degree from Ringling.
I love that, because I think a couple of things that you not only pointed out the storytelling, but another thing that I just want to point out to our audience is that one of the things about Gen Z, and especially Gen Alpha, that when you look at the research, they like to do things. They like to be a part of a group experiencing something. So you see a lot more people that are going to respond more to an experience than they will to, a piece of swag or something like that. And so I love the fact that you guys are having your students do those experiences, or you're having the students participate in an experience of that design for the cart, that they're experiencing something that's going to get them a scholarship. So that's wonderful. I love that.
When I visited here for my interview, it was a cool day in January. Now, cool has a different meaning in Sarasota, right?
Yeah.
You Northerners can't relate. But it was a nice, cool day on campus. I interviewed in January, and as part of my tour, we went by this building that looks kind of like a warehouse. And as I got closer, I could see that students were blowing glass. And I'm like, do we have a glass blowing major? And it's like, no. But it's art, and our students need to be exposed to this. And again, think about seeing that or witnessing that when you're on a campus tour.
Oh, yeah.
It just shows how dynamic that community is.
That's great.
You've been through many major leadership transitions and market shifts. When you first step into a new environment, what are the first things you look for to understand before initiating change?
Yeah, another great question, just because I've been here at Ringling now for just a few months. And I've got to tell you, I love change management. In fact, it was a major theme in my doctoral dissertation. I'm a student of John Kotter, so I love the 7 steps to effective change management. But then you have to realize that with that, you step into a culture. And I've been in cultures where they're vision driven, you know exactly where you're headed. And I've been in passive-aggressive cultures. The thing I have experienced in higher ed that maybe doesn't ring true to other industries is this commitment to shared governance. And because that's a real value in higher education, we as enrollment leaders and marketers need to learn to navigate the idea that there has to be buy-in across campus, oftentimes, for you to move anything. I think it was Mark Fields, he's the former CEO of Ford, that said culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Just for that reminder that we can have the best intentions, we can have proven strategies that have worked elsewhere, But then sometimes the culture we find ourselves in will just stifle that kind of creativity. So I've learned to come in, and you learn so much when you interview at an organization, but let's face it, you don't really know until you
Exactly.
arrive, right? And so I've been trying to lean into the innovative culture here and to find out, what's the pathway to change management. Is it through a cabinet? Is it through the president? And in my mind, at any organization, the president is the kind of the lead champion for change. As VPs and as a cabinet, we can influence that, but we really need to kind of work through our presidents on that. And we have a dynamic leader. One of his sexy jobs years ago was the founding CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Mm. And, he had to raise $90 million for that, and he had to work with business leaders and record producers to launch that exciting facility in Cleveland, Ohio. And then that set the stage for him to come to Ringling and expand our student body from a few hundred to more than 1,700 students. And so there's a growth expectation here that you might not find at every institution. And again, I think that's created kind of a dynamic atmosphere to perform change management in.
Yeah, I think that change management, a lot of times people hear that and people don't like change. That's just part of the culture. Other people think it's exciting. At the end of the day, it's just messy. And so, but I also know that as effective leaders, many times, and I fall into this trap that I want to change everything at once. It's like, hey, I see where things need to be fixed. I'm a solution type guy, and I'm like, let's go fix that. How do you prioritize that? You talked about, hey, having the president kind of lead some of the change, do those, but I know that, whenever you arrive, you've got fresh eyes. There's a lot of things that you're like, I think we could change these things, but how do you really prioritize what needs changed versus what needs to wait by weighing in different things? So just kind of explain that a little bit.
Yeah, there's definitely some tension in that, because I resonate with you, Bart. I'm by and large, I'm a pretty impatient person. And I think enrollment management attracts a kind, a person who likes to get in there and change it up. At my last institution, we made a lot of changes over the 18 years I was there. And I will admit there were some years where it was like, hey, Chopka, can we have a year without too much change so we can know what's working? Yeah. But here, I think the volatile dance we do when we start at a new institution is responding to a sense of urgency. In many ways, they hire an enrollment and marketing person because they want institutional change, and they admit that it's necessary to keep pace. And then on the other hand, they want to kind of protect the cherished qualities that have brought the college to its current reputation. And so I've been kind of dancing that dance, even in my new role here, doing the best I can to listen.
Yeah.
And I really count that as part of servant leadership. Servant leadership is what I really attempt to model for my team, and listening and hearing other people's ideas is a big part of that. I could come in and say, look, I have 35 years of experience. I know exactly what it's going to take to get from here to there. We're doing this. And I think that wouldn't work here.
Yeah.
I think having a collaborative approach. I had my first opportunity this last week here to present to a larger leadership body at Ringling. And I really was trying to be thoughtful in how I shared some news with them, and then also reminded them that we're in it together. We've all heard that African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And I like to remind folks who work at a college that it takes an entire campus to recruit and retain a student. So I think you start with a we're in this together mentality, but then you own kind of what's under your purview, and you're relentless in pursuing next level excellence.
Okay. I love that advice because I know there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that are either, in leadership roles, whether it's presidents or VPs. There's a lot of people that are maybe in director roles, or they're kind of listening as even like admissions counselors and things like that. And so, but they feel the sense of, wanting to be a change agent. And I love the idea that you had there about helping them, earn the right to do that by listening. I love the fact that you said that. And I also love the fact that you kind of talked about servant leadership. I mean, again, being a change agent is more about serving everyone rather than something you're going to do yourself. Maybe kind of reflect back on that.
Yeah. I get to speak to another organization in another week or two about servant leadership. So it's really fresh on my mind. And it can be a cliche. We can all say, oh, I'm a servant leader, but I think what that entails is showing folks that you're willing to do the hard work with the team. It's not about standing off on the sidelines and barking out orders.
Yeah.
And so that's been a tender balance here. I've had to approach some conversations kind of with sensitivity to say, this is how we've been doing this. Can you see how it might not be as productive and that perhaps a change is necessary before I just plow in
right.
and suggest, my improvement plan to everybody. On the other hand, there are expectations that some things are going to change.
Right.
And it's just having wisdom, and hopefully the 35 years behind me to this point have given me enough wisdom to know, where that low-hanging fruit is.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that we forget that as servant leaders, it's serving someone well to set expectations for them. It's serving them well to make clear expectations. And so I think that's just something that I would add as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of my challenge is being a servant leader it still requires wisdom. It still requires vision. And it still requires courage to have those hard conversations.
Yeah.
And I that's the stuff that can keep a leader awake at night. Because you want to work well with colleagues. You want to give people the benefit of the doubt. You want them to give you the benefit of the doubt. But then you see where we can achieve that next level excellence, which is something I say a lot. Next level excellence. How do we get there from here?
Yeah.
And it's not always easy.
Yeah.
John, the last topic that we wanted you to speak on is when times are tough. When it comes to self-leadership through change, how do you steady yourself as a leader when everything feels uncertain, and what habits or perspectives keep you grounded?
Well, I'm pretty much a classic extrovert. Bart probably knows that about me. But I have become much more comfortable with alone time, as I've matured. And it's during that time where I spend time reading, praying, seeking guidance. And I'm also a nature guy. When I lived in Pennsylvania, it was time along the Appalachian Trail or a bike ride on country roads. Now that I'm in Southwest Florida, it's podcasts during drive time and walks on the beach. It's not a bad gig, is it?
No.
But I've also used some good reads to generate conversation with my leadership teams. Everything from classics like Good to Great to popular books like Unreasonable Hospitality. I like to bring others into conversations that I often have with myself. It's not as lonely that way, And I would say Bart's book, Chasing Mission Fit, is going to make a good discussion guide for my marketing team. So there you go. A little shout out to Bart.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes too, when things do get tough and you're kind of doing those different things, and you just kind of talked a little bit about some of the ways you study yourself, but how do you decide, this goes back to a little bit maybe what we talked about with the change management is the idea of how honest to be when communicating to these key stakeholders and teams. You talked about earlier about having to make the presentation last week to some of your key leadership about, some things that maybe need to change, and so let's talk a little bit about just the nuances of being able to communicate effectively. We talked about that, the idea of being clear with expectations, but sometimes, too much information is too much information. And so talk through a little bit about how do you kind of thread that needle when you need to have conversations with your team or with your peers or with your leadership about things that are coming up that are tough topics?
Yeah, another one of my favorite books, and it's probably considered a classic now, is Stephen M.R. Covey's The Speed of Trust. Mm-hmm. And I just love that because I think in any organization, or really any relationship for that matter, trust is everything. And how we manage information kind of becomes a test of trust when we're within an organization. And I still remember I grew up professionally. My first job was with ServiceMaster, a service-oriented industry. I was a environmental services manager in a couple of hospitals. And we were kind of taught in the old days that knowledge is power, and you kind of protect, your position by holding on to certain information. I have found that in higher education, as we are facing challenging times, the best practice is to be as transparent as possible, with a dose of optimism. I'm a fairly optimistic person, so it's hard for me to be doom and gloom, but to really be as transparent as possible about the challenges we're facing. And folks really appreciate data. I did a presentation last week. I used data to make my point, and I can't tell you how many folks came up. And I think I have buy-in for some of the things that we need to do next because of the way that I shared that challenging information.
I like that because I think that I've known you for a while. We've known each other for a while, and I think we both know that we both are optimists, and we try to approach things in that way. And I love your perspective on even bringing that up, that healthy optimism in leadership. And I think that's, as we kind of close out here in a second, I just want to point out to the audience that a lot of what John's talked about is the idea of having those healthy conversations, those healthy relationships, those healthy trust, ways that you can do that. And so much of it has to come out of optimism. I mean, we have to have that optimism. And some people, for John and I, that comes out of our faith. For other people, it might come out of other places and things like that. And so it's one of those things that I think that being an optimist is a value to that, but we also have to recognize that, it can be contagious, but it can also be sometimes too much for some people. And so maybe reflect on that just for a second, John, before Troy kind of closes us out.
Yeah, that's great. I've had to live into some of that tension being in enrollment management, no doubt. but I learned some time ago, though, it's not helpful to be overly rosy either. And so you kind of pit that against, neither do I want to start every conversation with, in these unprecedented headwinds and during these times of demographic cliffs, I just think we have to be careful, and we have to remember too that I said this earlier, we're in it together and we're playing the long game. Both you, Troy, and Bart, you've seen a lot of high turnover in enrollment management. And I think there's this false idea that you're just going to turn over your leader and that's going to be the miracle to turning things around in enrollment. And we all know that it's part of the formula. Your leadership's part of the formula. But we're playing the long game. And that's not always been easy for me because I already referenced the fact that I'm a impatient, results-oriented person. But for me, it goes back to a mix of listening and being inclusive. And it goes back to communicating expectations. And where we drop the ball, we admit that we need to clean it up. And as soon as the campus realizes that you're there to achieve, again, next level excellence, they'll start to trust where you're taking them in this journey of improvement. Yeah. And, it won't take long. I've got some work to do, but it won't take long until you have a well-oiled machine. But it's this whole idea that trust is the foundation, and you deliver on what you say you're going to deliver. You express enough optimism to secure that buy-in, and you trust people by sharing information, even if they don't always want to hear it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
John, if you had one piece of advice for leaders at niche institutions, who are staring down big transitions or challenges like we've discussed, what would it be?
There are a lot of lone rangers in this industry. And I've already alluded to the fact that it can get kind of lonely, but my biggest piece of advice is don't go it alone. Bart knows this about me, but I've long had a special group of colleagues. I called it my best practices group. And I've leaned on that group at various stages throughout my career, pretty heavily at times. In fact, I think it's with that group where I first met Bart.
I think it is. That's what I was thinking.
As a guest speaker. And it's just a phenomenal group of colleagues that on their respective campuses, they're living what I'm living on my campus. In some ways, folks would think we're competitors. But when we got together, we gave each other just the right dose of reality and encouragement that we needed to sustain us in this profession. So it can be a lonely and pressure-packed profession. If you don't have a best practices group or a peer support team, whatever you want to call it, start one.
Yeah.
We've been talking to Dr. John Chopka. He's the Vice President for Enrollment Management and Marketing at Ringling College of Art and Design. John, if someone would like to connect with you or maybe follow your work, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I believe I'm the only John Chopka on LinkedIn. So let's start there, and I would love to connect with other higher ed marketers.
That's awesome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be invited onto this podcast. Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bart, do you have final thoughts before we close our conversation down?
Yeah, I was looking forward to this conversation all week. I really appreciate everything that John says, and I always look forward to talking with him. So this was a lot of fun for me personally. But I think also just thinking through, I know a lot of us are working at small privates or institutions that kind of have that niche audience. And I would make an argument if you're like, well, not really, I don't, maybe not. I would encourage you that, yeah, you probably do, because every institution needs to have some kind of element about them that's distinctive. So even if you're at a large flagship, you might be within the School of Business. You might be you're going to have something that is going to be specifically niched down for a certain group of students that are kind of what I call the mission fit students. And so I think a lot of what we talked about here today is really good. And I just love the fact that we had so much conversation around just good leadership principles and managing change and having, building trust and having optimism and things like that. And so I'm just really grateful that John had agreed to come on the conversation and to just share with his wisdom. And, we're a couple of the older guys now, which I have a hard time saying, but but it's one of those things that I'm just so eager to pour into the next generation. So take John up on, reaching out to him or take him up on where can you find that peer group that you need? Because I know those gentlemen in that group that he was talking about, and they are rock solid leaders in their industry, and you guys need to have similar groups that can help you develop your career. So thanks, John.
Good word, Bart. Thanks again.
Yep.
Thank you, Bart. And for our listeners, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Higher Ed Marketer. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with a colleague and follow us on LinkedIn at The Higher Ed Marketer. The podcast is brought to you by Kaler Solutions, your trusted partner in higher ed branding, enrollment strategy, and mission fit marketing. We'll see you next week with another great guest and conversation.
The Higher Ed Marketer podcast is proud to be a part of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast Network. Discover even more conversations, resources, and tools to help you grow your institution at thehigheredmarketer.com, your go-to community for all things higher ed marketing and leadership.